Today, it is February 3rd, 2021, and I have the privilege and honor of interviewing Sir Professor Harry Bhadeshia. This interview is being conducted and recorded via AIME's Zoom account because of COVID-19 pandemic. Professor Bhadeshia, who goes by Harry, my PhD mentor, is the Tata Steel Professor of Metallurgy at the University of Cambridge and also Fellow of the Darwin College. In 2015, Harry was knighted by the Queen of England for his research on steels and also deploying highly advanced steels in real-life applications. My name is Suresh Babu, and I go by Suresh. I'm a professor at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and also have a joint appointment with U.S. Department of Energy's Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Harry, thank you for your willingness to help us capture your story this way. Let me start with my first drive, long distance drive from University of Cambridge to London. I still remember this. In 1992, you took me to your parents' house on our way to Institute. And during that travel, you talked about their role in your life and career and early days of your academic pursuits. And I have a text from your PhD thesis. So let me read it out and then we can start with that. So the last sentence goes like this. Finally, it seems to me that I owe so much to my parents that to express my gratitude in words would surely lead me to exceed the 60,000 word quota. Signed, Harry Bhadeshia, September 1979. That actually touched me quite a lot. So with that, let's go into some of the questions and I look forward to hearing from you. So let's start with our question one. Can you talk about your childhood, your parents, and how they supported and inspired you?
First of all, Suresh, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I know you are an extremely busy person, but thank you. So my childhood, I was born in Nairobi in Kenya, and one of four children to my parents, Nurmada and Dharamshi. And we were not particularly well off, but what was absolutely certain was that my parents placed great emphasis on studies and performing well in studies. And we'd be in trouble if we didn't perform well in studies, okay? And they did sacrifice quite a lot to ensure that all four children actually managed to get a reasonable education. I think that is a trait in many Indian parents, but the fact that you have to go through quite a lot of hardship to pay for schooling and so on was particularly pronounced in our family because of four children and one person earning all the income, whereas my mother was a fantastic home builder, if you like. That's modern terminology, okay? In the old days, we used to call it housewife, but it meant the same thing. And then we had quite a lot of trauma when Kenya became independent from Britain. It used to be a colony of Britain. And there was a 2-year period where we were not allowed to take any jobs. So we had to survive by selling things, effectively, until the British government actually allowed us to migrate to the UK. And we were living on top of a shop in London, yeah, for want of finding better accommodation. And, you know, things were tough at that time. So as soon as we came, I started with a job at the British Oxygen Company. And it was in the metallurgical quality control laboratories, okay? And do you know what my salary was?
I don't know, Harry. Please let me know.
It's eight British pounds per week. Okay.
Wow.
That includes all the costs of travel and so forth. And then my parents managed to buy a house because, you know, it's London and it's very expensive and their life savings, basically. And the house itself cost just £4,000 in those days, okay? But £4,000 meant a lot if you compare with the salary that I used to earn. So they did extremely well and took a leap of faith in committing their entire life savings from selling everything back in Kenya to buying this house. And my mother was the first one who got a job in Britain. And she used to make dresses. And she worked incredibly hard, you know, because we had the mortgage to pay and family to support and so on. And then my father got a job as well, and so on and so on. So the parents, without the vision of the parents and the sacrifices they made, you know, I don't know what the future would have been. So that it is absolutely true that, you know, if I did express all that in my thesis, I would have exceeded the word quota.
Thank you, Harry, for sharing that. It is actually touches me. So many ways we see the same thing with the parents having a big influence. I really thank you for sharing that also. And going along that way, as you went into the company, British Oxygen, so do you need to commute a long distance, or how did you go there?
So I had to catch 2 buses, and the total journey took 2 hours if the traffic was flowing, okay? So, and then the journey back home. But, you know, you could read on the bus, you know? And there were 2 particular books that I repeatedly read. One was about electricity and one was about magnetism. The other one was about magnetism.
Wow.
And people used to criticize me, you know, why are you reading the same book again and again? And the truth is, I couldn't understand many things in those books, okay?
I completely understand. I still remember when I couldn't read the thermodynamics of Bainite transformation, I had to read many, many times. I still remember that paper. So thank you, Harry. So as we are moving along the story of going into the company, one of the things that caught my attention when I was listening to your video introduction you gave when you became a fellow of Royal Society, you talked about a human resources person on how he encouraged you to study further. And then can you describe the same to the audience here too, please?
Yes, so I was only 16 years old when I took up the job as a technician in the metallurgy laboratory. And the human resources person came to see me. You know, he said to me, look, you really ought to be studying, which I would like to do, but there wasn't an opportunity. So he arranged for me to have a day off. And in those days, you could study with 1 day and an evening. Yeah. So you did that every week. And eventually, if you pass the examinations, that would allow you to enter a university. So the point, the real point is that, you know, at that time, the racial tensions were really high in London. We had the National Front and so on. This was a white person, you know, who came to see me and said, look, you have to be studying. And after I finished that, and the company sponsored me to go to do a degree, but he was the one who got me the sponsorship to go and do a degree at the City of London Polytechnic. So, you know, this really, I've said this before, but it really brings back your faith in humanity, that there are people of all kinds who are nice, whereas we tend to focus on the other side of the spectrum.
I can relate to that, Harry, that sometimes some random person as the kind one sets us in a different direction, and in a way it helps us also. And so coming along that, as you're going into study in London, and when did you choose to go to University of Cambridge to pursue your study?
So my degree course was at the City of London Polytechnic, and during the summer vacations, I would go back to the company and they would pay me and so on. But the final examinations in Britain, where you actually get a degree, you have to have an external examiner from another place to check that everything is, you know, done fairly. And the final examiner has a big job, to look at the manuscripts to see whether the marking is fair. See, even before the examination, they check whether the papers themselves are good enough for the qualification. And the person who was the external examiner happened to be Professor Robert Honeycomb from Cambridge. And he said to me that you must apply to go to Cambridge. So I looked, after that, I looked at the application procedure, and it was, for me, it was confusing. There were 34 colleges, okay, and departments. So I didn't apply. And then one day my tutor at the City of London Polytechnic said, have you applied? And I said, I explained, and he got really furious with me. Okay, so we sat together and we made the application, and then I started with a PhD. So the PhD was supposed to be about retained austenite. So before I went there, I actually reviewed the literature, and there's a very famous paper by Maurice Cohen from MIT, actually completely on retained austenite. And I copied it all out by hand, including the diagrams. Okay.
Wow.
So it was a really nice experience to be able to read something from a person like Maurice Cohen. People outside of our subject may not know who Maurice Cohen is, but he was one of the fathers of the subject.
Thank you, Harry. So I'm going to follow up on that. So as you went through the literature review, and it may be a kind of give a glimpse about those days, how we went about doing literature review compared to the current days. And that
there was no internet, okay. But we were very fortunate because right next to, there are huge numbers of libraries in Cambridge, but there was a particular library right next to our department. You just walk down and you walk into the scientific periodicals library. And then you look through the card indices about where is this and where is that. And the science, if you like, the Scopus equivalent was basically indices, volumes and volumes of indices. So you would look in each volume under the term retained austenite or Bainite to find the papers, then get the hard versions, read them, return them to the library. Now, I don't know which system is better, okay? because you do need time to read things, So now we can access millions of papers, but there's no way you can absorb all those papers.
I completed.
Yeah.
I still remember one interaction during my PhD is that the library was next door to the tea room. And then when we used to have arguments, and then we go there and pick up the book and read it. And so used to say that, Suresh, the photocopying paper is not good enough. You need to dig deeper. So,
but the coffee room was fantastic, wasn't it?
That's correct. Very close to the tea place also. So having said that, I'm going to transition to your thesis as a way. Many of the young researchers who are coming into the PhD also, I'd like to kind of ask this leading question, so that leads to talk about your thesis. Like you talked about already, it's about theory and significance of retained austenite was your thesis. But how did you stumble on this topic? And you talked about a few, and then when you are going through that PhD, what were the challenges and tribulations? You kind of jumped out of that and then said, wow, I got it. So can you kind of share that feelings with us?
So of course, this is all in hindsight. So you look through rose-tinted glasses, okay? But there's no question, there's an awful lot of pain involved in doing a PhD thesis because you have to actually get some new knowledge, okay? Which is recognized as new knowledge. It is not just a repetition of what has been done in the past, but you have created new knowledge. That's the essence of a PhD. And my task was actually assigned by Professor Honeycomb and David Edmonds, who was my immediate supervisor, on retained austenite. But we had enormous freedom, okay? So I looked at the structures and I saw there was a huge amount of confusion in the topic of Bainite, which also leads to retained austenite when you have a certain amount of silicon. So Pommy and Deliri in France had shown that. But the mechanism was in complete disarray. If you picked up a book, it would dismiss Bainite by saying it's controversial, okay? Now, when there is a challenge, so I explained to you about those books on the bus. If you could understand the book in one go, it tends to be boring, yeah? What human beings like is a challenge. So I went into the literature in great detail, and there was a lot of literature on Bainite, and I identified some difficulties, did some experiments, and I would say that the key point was when the data agreed so well with the T0 curve, which defines the point beyond which transformations cannot happen if they involve a composition change. And the remainder, going towards equilibrium, that curve was far, far away from T0. So the points all fell nicely close to the T0 curve. And that is where the adventures began, because obviously, as I said to you, it was a controversial subject. So the opposition was building up quite intensely, not at first, but when we started publishing the work.
So thank you, Harry. I still remember the MUCG 65 and then now calculating T0 and putting the lines and everything. So that's amazing. So let's set the stage.
So do you know what MUCG stands for?
No, Harry, please let me know.
Yeah. So in order to calculate the T0 curve and so on, you need thermodynamics, okay? And MU is mu for chemical potential, C is for carbon, and G for gamma. So in the Fortran program, MUCG referred to the chemical potential of carbon in austenite.
That is amazing. I will never forget it. I know. That's wonderful. So that leads to one of the things, the way you sometimes, I still remember in the coffee time, we were all struggling about the T0 concept. You used to draw with like a napkin and draw this T0 curves and explain to us. And that time I realized that if I at all I become a teacher, I need to become like a Professor Bhadeshia. When did you decide that you wanted to be a professor at University of Cambridge? And can you share your initial thoughts and trajectory as you went into that adventure?
There was no thought of that sort, absolutely none. We had one professor in the entire department, and people who were fellows of the Royal Society didn't have a professorship, okay? So you cannot imagine becoming a professor in the British sense, okay? So after my PhD, I became a Science Research Council fellow for 2 years. So I could completely independently pursue research within Honeycomb's umbrella, but it was direct funding for me to do work for 2 years. And I pursued many ideas on the same principles, phase transformations and designs of alloys. And then I applied for a position in the university, which was known as a demonstrator, right? Now, a demonstrator is like a 10-year track in the US. It's for 5 years, and you do teaching, you build up your research group, but it wasn't like these days where you need massive amounts of funding to build up a team. You yourself, for example, you were funded by the Cambridge Commonwealth Trust and so on. So we could obtain sufficient funding to do interesting things. And at the end, towards the end of the 5-year period, you can either get upgraded to what's known as a lectureship or not, and you leave. So it's almost exactly like tenure track. That position does not exist anymore. You go directly into a lectureship. Yeah? And then, you continue to do your research and so on. Teaching, of course, is a key part. My first ever course was a complete disaster. It was on the, the crystallographic theories and so forth. It was a master's course, graduate student course. And I had the most appalling reviews. Yeah, and I felt it myself, actually. that it was a disaster. So the university sent me to a course to learn how to teach at the University of Surrey. And then things went very well, okay? Because, who gave me the training to teach? I had no training at all. It was only on the basis of research that I was appointed. So after the lectureship, if you continue to do good research and, you're a good citizen of the department, then you might be promoted to a reader. And then eventually, a professorship. So it was never a planned career, and there were uncertainties, major uncertainties at each stage, when the fellowship ended, when demonstratorship was going to end, and so on.
So Harry, so that leads to the next one. So you have a great influence on a lot of people who pursue steel metallurgy directly or through web and a lot of people. So going back to you, as you building up your career, who influenced your academic research career trajectory? And what was the first eureka moment, like as you're going through? So can you share that also?
Yeah. So Robert Honeycomb and David Edmonds, they were, I think, very special people, scholars and gentlemen. Okay. So I was developing ideas which they did not agree with. They were David Edmonds was my immediate supervisor, and Robert Honeycomb had been the head of department for something like 18 years, the single professor in the department. And they told me once that if you go down alleyways, you are likely to get mugged. Okay. But give them all credit. They allowed me to continue when I talked about the T0 curve and that the mechanism of transformation is not what Honeycomb had written in his book, and so on. They allowed me to continue, and that is the mark of a good university, really. I felt no threat at all,
I still remember that, Harry, that about pursuit of truth as a part of that training which I received, and it goes back to your teaching also.
Yeah.
And
the other person who I must mention, because I was deviating from the sort of things that were normally done in the steel group. So I needed a great deal of theory, which I didn't have. So the other person who influenced me enormously was Jack Christian from Oxford. He once spent an entire day with me. So this is the world famous Jack Christian, the leader in phase transformation theory. And I wrote to him and he wrote back. I went there and he spent an entire day with me. Okay.
Amazing.
And eventually when I went on sabbatical to MIT, I spent the whole time reading his book from page 1 to the end, the classic theory of transformations in metals and alloys. And he too was a perfect gentleman, So we had such a huge difference in achievement. And yet he treated me just like anybody else. Yeah. Furthermore, he was so clever that I once made the mistake of not asking a question. So we were writing something together, and he said to me, molybdenum, obviously there will be solid drag effects because molybdenum diffuses slower than iron. So I said to him, no, actually it diffuses faster than iron. So he thought and said, that's the solute effect of diffusion. And I did not have any idea what that meant. I don't know that today, okay? I should have asked. I felt that it would be a stupid question, but I should have asked, okay?
I think that's a great way to lead into that. You should have a discussions, and that's Professor Jack Christians. I still remember you recommended that I buy that book. Actually, I did go and buy that for 75 pounds.
Yeah.
And one of my students took it. Now he has it. So
okay, well, that's a good way. Good way. Yeah.
So,
okay. So I have it here actually. You can see how bedraggled it looks. Okay, so I still use it, And of course, there are new editions, but I'm loyal to this one, you know.
And I still remember that what the discussions we had in the coffee table is that there is a Christian's book in the library. I used to take it to my room, but I never read it. And once you said, Suresh, unless otherwise you buy it, you will not read it. So I remember that going, buying the book and reading that as you recommended. So thank you, Harry. That is a great way to talk about your mentors and trajectory also. So that leads to your favorite topic, that is steels. Okay, so you have provided like quite a lot of demonstrated passion for steel research, and then can you talk about some of the innovations that came in your long research in steels, and in the last actually 5 decades or so? So can you kind of take us through the journey?
Well, I think obviously, you know, the mechanism of the Bainite transformation features a lot because I tell you why, not because it's simply an academic argument, but you can use the theory in order to actually design practical steels. Whereas if you're just saying, okay, this is, you know, happening by diffusion or by shear, and you stop there, then you're actually missing something, because until you use the theory, you don't realize the pitfalls associated with the theory. So the T0 concept, and you know, Aronson had a role in that because he tried to use it to disprove the displacive mechanism. But the fact is that the T0 curve allows you to calculate in steels where the precipitation of cementite is retarded very accurately how much transformation you should have and the stability, both mechanical and thermal, of the austenite that remains. Now, how can you use this? So in my work with David Edmonds, we had you know, he was my supervisor. We had a small breakthrough which helped use the theory to design properties. And the breakthrough now seems very simple and is referred to casually in lots and lots of papers, but it's as follows. You know, if you have a mixture of bainite plates and retained austenite, that should be an ideal composite because you've got the strength from the ferrite and you've got the toughness from the austenite and trip effect and blah, blah, yeah? When we did the experiment, the toughness was awful, okay? So we looked and figured out that, you know, these blocks of austenite are responsible because the thermodynamics tells you the reaction will stop no matter how long you hold. So these blocks will not disappear. So you've got to do something by calculation to reduce dramatically the size of the blocks. And of course, the T0 curve helps you to do that. So without doing any further experiments, we designed 2 steels which would maintain the strength levels, but cut down the size of those austenite islands, and voila, you know, lots of toughness at cryogenic temperatures plus strength. And eventually that led to the design of the rail steel, which now is in the Channel Tunnel. And in April, I received a message that it has done 1 billion metric tons of traffic.
Wow.
Okay, without the need for grinding. So normal rails are ground to remove any fatigue damage. So this has exceptional rolling contact fatigue damage as well. So that is an application which is in service. And then of course we have the bulk nanostructured steel and some rolling elements in bearings are made from the bulk nanostructured bainite, but the essence is the same. You know, it's a mixture of plates of bainite and austenite, and it's a very versatile structure because you can change the scale.
That's great.
By altering the temperature.
Thank you, Harry. And also you used to mention that one of your super bainite wire is in the museum holding.
Yeah. So that's a fun experiment that I did with Saurabh Chatterjee. Yeah, and we did some calculations to show there's no particular limit to the lowest temperature at which bainite can form. Yeah. So for example, if you had, in a particular alloy system, if you had 1 weight % carbon, it would take 100 years for bainite to form at room temperature. So we made a sample, right? We made a sample, we polished it completely flat, sealed it up in an inert atmosphere in a quartz tube, and we started that experiment in 2004. So it will be completed in 2104. And you will be able to see if there's transformation by the surface relief, but it should produce incredibly fine bainite plates. So, you know, you have to tell your children about this story so that they can verify it. Okay, because I'm not likely to be around in 2104. Okay, so.
That is a nice story, Harry. In fact, I would recommend whoever listening this to, like, you can go and get like some of the laser things, and then you can look at the surface relief.
Yeah, so it's stored in the Science Museum at room temperature at 24 degrees centigrade.
Thank you, Harry. So that's actually, you talked about Sarah in that experiment, and also other people who work with you also. So you're known for mentoring just under PhD, 100 PhDs. And also not only mentoring PhD students, you also inspire other researchers. But as a professor, I always wondered, what is your magic behind this infinite source of enthusiasm and trying to get other people motivated to pursue the truth and research?
I think the students have to take credit for that, because I tell them that when they go for the PhD examination, I will not be there, okay? So if they pass, they have to take the credit. If they fail, I will not take the credit, okay? So the students have been very good, and the atmosphere in Cambridge is I'm going to cause controversy by saying it's the best in the world, okay? So we have such an environment there that you don't need to encourage people. They will be talking to people from so many different subjects, and they will be meeting people who have achieved an awful lot, and so on. So you would have to work hard not to do a good PhD, okay?
So I still remember that one of the favorite moment of mine is that you will call me and say that, Suresh, let's talk about it. Let's go to the metallurgy lab. And I will be moving from annex, and then I will see you like a crisscrossing across that the stairways. And I wonder, how did you move so fast? And then I said, well, it is displacive transformation. Harry.
Well, you know, I remember the experiment that you did of acicular ferrite under stress. That was the first ever experiment where, you know, the basket weave structure changed into an aligned structure. And at first, you were so keen to show it to me when Lars Erik Svensson visited. But I said, we'll talk about it later. But when I saw it, you know, it was amazing.
So yeah, as you mentioned, that it takes a village, and the atmosphere makes the PhD students to pursue that. And that leads to the next topic. So, Harry, we are transitioning into some of the professional development and milestones along your career. You've written more than 500 papers, many books. And one of the things many of my students actually comment about reading your papers and everything is about how crisp it is. And then when they read it, they can kind of internalize what you're writing. And so please share your passion on that. And also, how do you go about disseminating the knowledge and also focusing on readers who read your papers?
Thank you, Suresh. Don't forget that the 500 papers you talk about is over a period of something like 50 years in the subject, okay? So it's not actually a large quantity in that respect. And of course, I had really good students and collaborators as well. I learned from Jack Christian, you know, Oxford is the holder of the English language. And people who are educated in Oxford actually have wonderful styles of writing. So if you read his book or any of his review articles, they are written concisely and precisely, with every sentence pregnant with meaning. Now that, of course, means you have to read it many, many times, okay, to completely get the gist of what is being said. But as I said to you, a challenge is a good thing. So I tried to emulate that and didn't succeed very well initially. Once I submitted a paper with lots of emphasis, that means underlined things, and the referee said, look, if you underline too many times, then it loses the significance of being an emphasis. So there was a learning process, and inspired very much by reading Christian's review articles and books and so on. So I think we were not under pressure at all to publish. The pressure that exists now. You know, you published when you wanted to. I didn't publish any papers until 1979, after my PhD, effectively. So nowadays there's, you know, it's indecent pressure actually to publish. The book is a different story. The first book was a short book, Geometry of Crystals, on the course that went disastrously, I was telling you about, the teaching course. But over a period of 5 years, I learned how to do it better. And that's when I wrote that book, Geometry of Crystals. And eventually I was able to make it completely freely available. The Institute of Materials, which published it, allowed me to simply put it on my website, which was great. Now, there are advantages to doing this because many people in the world do not have access to funds to buy books, and they can easily download. If 1% of the people who download the stuff actually read it, you know, that is amazing. Yeah. The second book, so Honeycomb was writing his book on steels, the first edition. And David Edmonds was also supposed to be the author, but David Edmonds was a research fellow of the Royal Society, and someone made a comment that he shouldn't be writing books. So Honeycomb wrote it by himself. And he gave me 2 chapters to look at before publication. One was on martensite, and the other was on bainite. And I commented on the martensite one, but I said, look, I don't want to comment on this one because I don't agree with anything. Okay. So he respected that, you know, and he put it in the acknowledgement in that book. So the subject was actually in turmoil. And over a period of years, you know, up to 1991, I started to compile a book on bainite. You know, no limits to size, simply collecting. I mean, you were there when it was published, right? So it isn't just about a mechanism, but it covers all aspects of the bainite transformation. And when you do that, you know, you can present a coherent story which fits. Whereas if you just write a paper on a particular topic, you may ignore a lot of the other evidence, which is common these days in publications. Yeah? So the idea was to produce a coherent book which covers all aspects of bainite in a consistent manner where things fit. And of course, now it's in the 3rd edition, and I've just received the Chinese translation.
Oh,
okay.
nice.
Yeah, so that has been published this year of the 3rd edition of bainite. And again, I was able to make those freely available. The early edition, no problem. Then it was taken over by Taylor and Francis. And I said to them, look, if I don't take royalties, can I make it freely available after 30 months? And no problem. Okay. Yeah. And the books still keep on selling, even though they're freely available. Okay. So it's possible to make books open access without much pain, you know, if you plan it ahead of time.
So I have many instances, many people who work in the industry have read your paper and used to have a discussions about some other, how the lucid way of talking about reconstructive and displacive transformations, even though it's not only Bainite, but it also talks about the mechanisms. So I used to think that, wow, how it is amazing how people can relate to when you're reading the papers on this general knowledge and phase transformation. So,
and of course, I gave a copy to Professor Honeycomb, and after he looked at it, he said to me, look, we are planning on a second edition of the Steele's book, and you have carte blanche to alter completely the chapter on Bainite and add any other chapter. So we wrote the second edition together, yeah, and it's now in its 4th edition, the book on Steele's.
Beautiful. So
so that's what I mean by this concept of academic freedom. Doesn't mean that you get your salary whatever you do, but it means that when you have a disagreement with someone who is superior to you, in a superior position, they don't actually do anything to stop you. Yeah, they give you the freedom to dig your own hole, if you like. Okay.
So that actually, taking on that little bit about dissemination of knowledge and everything, I still remember when you started the materials algorithm project, and then also putting some of your teaching and seminars on the videos on that. So you were like a pioneering that area also, a lot of following. So when you were developing that, so what was your thought process? Can you kind of give us some idea about it?
Well, Suresh, you remember that whenever a student left, we lost the material, whether it's a computer program or micrographs, etc. And that should not happen, So if you want to find out what Darwin was doing on a particular day, you can find all his notes. For a modern student, you will not be able to do that after they've left. So it doesn't make sense, we should develop from what has been done in the past, and just looking at publications is not enough. You need to look at the data and everything else that goes in creating that. I mean, for one micrograph published, there might be 1,000 more which are not published. So 1997 was the breakthrough when, we all got access to the internet, and that made it possible, to put your materials on the web for anybody, anywhere in the world, any time of day or night to access. Before that, it would be like what we do with Darwin, that there will be several people researching his documents, discovering them, and so on.
So that's actually one of the things I would point out is that the Cambridge University right now puts all theses electronically, but you did that beforehand for all your PhD students, from #1 PhD students. I still remember walking into your office, you used to have a scanner, you used to scan while you're reading and everything. And in fact, you scan the whole thesis and then put it in the web also, and including Roger's big thesis too.
That's right.